This is part 2 of the exciting program Expressions of Noose, designed to stimulate your curiosity and to encourage you to look beneath the surface of everyday experience. We are proud to present Dr. Onslow Wilson, Director of the Department of Instruction, and your host, Mary Bourdon, Class Master at Rosicrucian Park.
Welcome to part 2 of our discussion on Noose. In part 1, we discussed the forces of nature and how they manifest by first learning the difference between energy and force. Then we explored the dual aspects of Noose, namely spirit energy and vital life force, as organizing principles growing in complexity through crystallography and cell division. We will now continue our discussion of Noose in relation to consciousness and the Rosicrucian ontology. Father Wilson, I want to get back to pattern. I'd like to know first where the pattern is in the human form, and then where the pattern is, if any, for the sequence of unfoldment for the consciousness.
As I indicated, it seems to me, at any rate, that the pattern is at least at the level of the subconscious mind. Now, I have another slide here, which represents the enclosure that goes into the fifth monograph of the third temple degree. And it deals with man's mental processes. And as you can see, it consists of objective mind, subjective mind, the subconscious mind, and then the cosmic. At the level of the subconscious mind, we have things like instincts. And when we think of instincts, the first thing that pops into mind is the instinct to self-preservation. Well, it seems to me that the self must pre-exist the drive to preserve itself. It must exist in order to...
Prior to even the recognition of it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Therefore, if the instinct to self-preservation is resident in the subconscious mind, it seems to me that the self, which has this urge to preserve itself, must be at least at a deeper level of the subconscious mind, or certainly would be in what we would call a cosmic mind, a divine mind.
Wow, and keeping in mind, not to be using a pun about it, when we remember that the word noose means mind, can we draw the conclusion that really the whole idea of noose, or the energy that comes from the divine intelligence, God, or whatever we choose to call it, it all goes back to a oneness or a source?
It does, and it's not speculation. The fact is, yes, nous is an old Greek term for mind, and there's the old injunction that the universe is mental. If we want to get back to this whole business of energy again, energy comes out of separation, polarity. If there's no polarity, there's no energy, there's no force. Why should there be? So nous is dual. In other words, mind itself is dual. We as individuals have a quote-unquote outer mind and an inner mind. And because those two are quote-unquote separated, at least in our realization, there is energy, there's polarity. There's energy and there's force.
But as I look at it, it's like looking at a spectrum. It's hard to tell where, like the rainbow, it's hard to tell where the green stops and the blue starts.
Exactly.
So it feels like there are various gradations, but it's not obvious to us as human beings with our brain consciousness to absolutely distinguish where one thing leads from one to the other. That's where it leads me then to ask you the question, what makes us different from the ape then? I mean, we look just, our forms and so forth, and the human being body looks very much the same, but there's obviously a difference.
Well,
and does that bring us back to that
well, yes, it does, because again, the difference between, for the materialistic scientist who believes that DNA is the beginning and end of all physical existence in terms of living systems, when we look at the DNA of man versus the DNA of the ape, the difference is less than 2%.
That's all?
That's all. And if the difference, if what we are is determined by the DNA content of our cells, then clearly that must be one heck of a 2%. It must be the most important 2%, at least in our realization.
Yes.
But another way of looking at it would be that what makes man man is not his DNA, but that divine spark that we call the inner self, the self, the real self, not the personality or the things that we build around it to deal with the outer world and by reflection the inner world. The real self, that's what makes the difference between man and ape and dog and plant and so forth, etc., etc. So we come back to the whole idea of where the pattern is. It seems to me that on the basis of what we're saying, anyway, the pattern has to be either very deep in the quote-unquote subconscious mind or certainly within that aspect that we call the cosmic.
From all that you're saying, I'm getting the feeling then, too, that that admonition of know thyself,
Exactly.
truly, if we do approach the purest sense of that know thyself, we as even human beings could eventually find ourselves in perhaps in a more complex organism that someday someone would be sitting on a television program maybe and saying, well, what makes us different from the ordinary man?
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. So it just feels like there's a progression at work here.
This is what Rosicrucian teachings are about. We'll each discover for ourselves as we grow in our particular little umwelts.
In addressing man's mental capabilities, it appears that the more complex or refined the human organism becomes, man is able to either have more advanced thinking or greater imagination. Would you comment about this a little bit more?
First of all, I think we have to be careful in the choice of terms. I wouldn't like us to think that man is going to become more complex. Complexity is a very touchy term to use because, especially at the level of ferns anyway, it's known that some ferns have a lot more chromosomes than man does, so that we have to be careful that we're not implying that man will become more complex in his physical nature. The psychologists, however, have recognized that the more, let us say, refined, the term that you use, the more refined the organism, there seems to be more of the ability to consciously control, manipulate, use the attributes inherent in what we're calling vital life force. And in man, this level of control is manifested most clearly in his subjective phase of consciousness, what Rosicrucians call the subjective phase of consciousness. The objective phase, as you know, has to do with being aware of the outside world as it comes to us through our physical senses. The subjective phase is when we are not thinking of the outside, we are not in the outside world at all, we're not receiving any impressions from our physical senses. All of the physical senses are quote-unquote shut down, and we are dwelling in a subjective state, and we can think, and we can imagine, and so forth, etc. We can remember. This is a subjective state, and man seems to have the widest range of abilities in this subjective state of any being. So as man becomes more and more refined, he's going to refine his abilities and uses of these attributes of vital life force as it manifests in that particular phase of consciousness.
That must also include reason, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes.
The reasoning faculties and how man becomes more able to discriminate or distinguish within.
Well, the interesting thing that's happening these days is that science is becoming more and more aware that other animals do reason, but certainly not to the same extent as man does. We usually associate tool making, for example, specifically with man. Once upon a time, that was the case. Now we're beginning to think differently because there's a particular species of birds, for example, in Africa that love to feast on ostrich eggs. And the ostrich egg, the shell is very thick. And what the bird will do is take a rock and throw it at the egg until it breaks. This is a kind of a tool making. Limited, it is true. But when we look at that in relationship to what man can do, we find that man has a much wider range, a much greater ability to make tools, and therefore he's much better able to think and reason than this particular bird, for example. The bird obviously realized that its beak cannot break the shell, and therefore it has to decide how it's going to get in there, and decides on a rock. There have been experiments done with a particular species of monkeys in Japan, in which these monkeys used to live in the wild quite naturally, and then people started going to visit this place. It's a kind of a national park, and they would feed the monkeys sweet potatoes and so on. They live close to the beach. Well, the sweet potatoes and so on would get sand in them. And one day, a female monkey decided to wash the potato, went to the beach and washed the potato to get the sand out. This is reasoning. And this particular habit spreads slowly through the community. So there is learning, there is reasoning. But again, the point I'm trying to make is that you will find these attributes of thinking, the thinking process, you will find it at nearly all levels of existence. But man has the greatest ability. It's not that we have something exclusively that others do not have. We simply have a greater ability, a greater facility, the same attributes.
Then would you say it would be possible that we can grow in subjective awareness? Is that possibility existing?
This would be my opinion, yes. And as we grow in subjective awareness, then we learn better how to cope with our environment. And the thing is that many of us, and this is one of the beauties of our Rosicrucian philosophy, too many of us have the tendency to want to grow in subjective awareness only from an intellectual point of view, and this is based on sense perceptions only. From the Rosicrucian point of view, that is one part of it. The other part of it is looking inward. In other words, dealing with the inner world and getting directives from there and integrating these two, so that yes, we can grow in subjective awareness.
So it appears to me that the more we learn to look within and make a contact with this inner self, the reasoning is already there, the beautiful reasoning, correct, pure reasoning. It's just that we need to grow into learning how to best use that reasoning. It's already there. But
as you know, in the subjective phase of consciousness, we have complete reasoning. We have deductive, inductive, and syllogistic reasoning. In the subjective phase of consciousness, we have only deductive reasoning. Now, the importance of this whole business of complete reasoning in the subjective phase of consciousness is that it allows us to examine things from our experiences from various points of view before we make up our minds as to what it means. Because the minute we decide on what it means, which is a subjective judgment anyway, it will fall into subconscious mind. Subconscious mind uses that as a law. It deals only with deductive reasoning, and it goes from what's there to what's happening out here. So that the whole business of the complete reasoning in the subjective phase of consciousness is a very, very important thing for man. Many of us don't use it, but it's there. And one of the things we learn as Rosicrucians is how best to use this and to keep our prejudgments out of our reasoning, because that can really taint it.
As I'm listening to you, I'm also getting some more thoughts in that the whole idea of one of the basic ideas of our teachings is to help us make that contact with the Master within. And our teachings also go on to tell us how we develop our intuition. It seems on the one end, the master within that has all of this knowledge, or I would say the most complete reasoning. I almost am inclined to think that at some point reasoning and intuition become one and the same thing. As more advanced that we become in our reasoning abilities and reach in to make the contact with the master within, that somewhere there will be truly a clear way between, or really a true communication between the inner self and the outer self, or that integration that we're trying to develop.
One of the things that I find particularly interesting is this business of myths, and how myths can encapsulate and preserve really profound principles. And the myth I'm thinking of is the Osirian myth. And as you know, Osiris had a twin brother. His name was Set, and he also had a sister whose name was Isis, and another sister whose name was Nephthys. Well, Set conspired to murder Osiris and mutilated him and scattered his parts all over the globe. And Isis, sister, wife, went about and gathered up all of these parts and brought them back together. It's a very nice story. People like it and have all sorts of interpretations for it. But the one that I particularly favor, especially in the context of what we're talking about now, the subjective phase of consciousness, is the fact that Set represents analysis. He represents the ability to take things apart.
Perhaps the intellectual mind?
You could call it that.
Okay.
Reasoning. Being able to look at it from this point of view, that point of view, the other point of view. Literally take things apart. Isis, on the other hand, represents that aspect of mind which can take these parts and bring them back together. Well, the more you take the parts, the whole, Osiris represents wholeness. The more you divide up the whole and take your experience and take it apart, the better able would be the Isian aspect to take those parts and rearrange them in a new way so that we can have a new realization. It's this new realization that we call intuition. Suddenly we have an intuitive flash that we should do this because it takes all of these parts with all the other pre-existing parts and puts them together and presents us with a brand new way of looking at things, and this we call intuition. So that the connection, at least as I'm seeing it at this point, the connection between intuition and reasoning is that intuition is like is a sister to reason. And if you don't reason, then forget intuition. You've got nothing. You haven't given. You haven't done your work. Let's put it that way. You do not deserve. You haven't given intuition anything to work with. If Isis is whole, what does pardon me, if Osiris is whole, what does Isis have to do?
That's a beautiful example, a very graphic picture of how that works. I have still a question, though, lingering in my mind, and that is, what happens when I'm unconscious?
When you're unconscious, you're not aware of what's going on out here. This is how most people would define unconscious, but there are several other ways of defining unconscious. For example, one could be unconscious of one's own behavior. There are many people who are unconscious of their own behavior.
Or is that awareness?
Well, I don't know that there's a distinction between the two.
Okay.
But at least in my mind. But when one is quote-unquote unconscious, I think in the sense that you mean it, you're asleep.
Yes.
Then you're not aware, first of all, you're not aware of the outer world. You may be aware of the inner world, and we may call that dreaming or having a vision, depending on your point of view. But you can also fall into another state where you're not conscious of anything at all, in terms of an outer awareness that you can recall and so forth, etc. When that happens, and even in the dream state, quote unquote, the psychic body has been separated from the physical body. when you sleep, this is basically what happens. Now, how far the psychic body goes from the physical body when one goes to sleep is another issue, if we can talk of distance in those terms. But the psychic body is much freer. It is then free to do things and to go places. If, for example, in one's thinking and in one's heart of hearts, one is the type who likes to give solace and succor to people who are suffering, one could find oneself, quote unquote, dreaming of being in a war zone, for example, and assisting people who have been wounded, children who are distressed by the whole scene, and so on. I know one father who would constantly dream of being in the Middle East during the crisis in not Iran, what's the name? Lebanon. And, you know, this is what happens when the psychic body is separated from the physical body. Now, what it does is determined by what one does in the subjective phase. What you're reasoning, what you're thinking, what your feelings are. These are things that then, quote-unquote, fall into the subconscious mind and predetermine how the psychic body is going to behave.
Coming along those terms, and trying to reconcile that the questions that I think still remain open, we're told in our teachings that accompanying the breath of life is the soul, also at which time the vital life force enters the human body. With all that we have said throughout this program, how can we reconcile that statement with what we have done?
Personally, I would say that when we say that with the first breath, the soul enters the body, God breathed into the nostrils of man, and man became a living soul. What we're talking about is the entry into the physical body of higher, more sublime frequencies of vital life force, which then enters that body and uses that body as a temple. We say the soul personality enters the body, and with that there's consciousness and so forth, etc. If that doesn't happen, then the body perishes. It simply disintegrates. So when we talk about vital life force entering the body at birth, what we're talking about is a principle entering that body at birth to organize it, to give it direction in its growth, in its unfoldment.
And the higher aspects,
yes,
then,
and concomitantly the unfoldment of the quote-unquote soul personality in that particular body. I think there's a quote somewhere in the monographs about the connection between vital life force and Noose.
And it could go something like this, that term is used really to refer to Noose, and it's a combination of both the vital life force and cosmic consciousness, as we have found defined in the Rosicrucian Manual.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Frater Wilson, for joining us here today. It's certainly been a pleasure to have had you here giving us your scientific insight into this most complex and fascinating subject. It has been so stimulating, and to summarize some of the more important points you made about the expressions of Noose, might we say that indeed vital life force and spirit energy are not separate. You have shown us examples of how they manifest together in inanimate or so-called dead matter, such as the crystals. Spirit energy manifests predominantly while vital life force is minimal. We have also seen how vital life force can be characterized as being directive, while spirit energy is associated with motion. You showed us that in inanimate or so-called dead matter, vital life force imposes order, again using the growing crystals as an example. And then as we progressed into the living animate matter, we have more of a balance. We see more of a balance between the two polarities. So here we witness more of a dynamic interplay between them, and this is what we call life. Then we saw that vital life force manifests as consciousness in the higher forms of life. And finally, in man, the vital life force which manifests in the psychic part of us allows us to take conscious control. As we become proficient in this, we truly approach the mastery of life as promised in our Rosicrucian teachings. I hope you all have gained a deeper understanding of Noose, fratres and sorors, as I certainly have. And so to conclude our program, we have arranged a series of examples of growing crystals in addition to those you have seen earlier. And now we invite you to feel free to relax, sit back, and allow yourself to thoroughly enjoy these last few minutes of this program. Thank you.
Expressions of Noose was produced in the studio of the Rosicrucian Order, a non-profit, non-sectarian, educational and fraternal organization with international headquarters located in San Jose, California. We hope you have enjoyed this program and that you have gained some additional insights that will assist in your understanding of Rosicrucian principles. Please join us again for another challenging presentation of Rosicrucian insight.